All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are, chapter 20. The subject being the African Americans at mid-century. So we're talking about really, the 1840s to the 1860s. In 1860 really being the beginning of the Civil War, um, which ultimately, reflects the institution of slavery and why that war was fought. So here we go. We got some interesting things, and I want to ask you some questions as well. So please follow along and let's do some thinking. So the question here we have: why did quilts like this one, made by a slave, provide comfort for slaves? Now I want you to look at some of the details that are found throughout this quilt. Okay. Ultimately, what these quilts do is they tell stories. You see here how stories progress and really give the heritage, the past, the history of the life of a slave. So this, provides comfort, has a purpose to preserve heritage, and really is a form of artwork. So I want you to think about some of the things that you see on this particular quilt. All right. So in section 2, I want to describe how African Americans were viewed in the South as well as the North. If you take a look at some of the pictures, it gives you some insight into the type of work, what a community may have looked like. In the South, slaves ultimately are defined as property, something that can be owned, can be taxed. Similar to a piece of livestock or a piece of land. You treat it as you wish because you are the owner of it. So the South viewed African Americans as property. We take a look at the North. Undoubtedly, they lived freer lives, but still faced a lot of discrimination. There was a lot of racism that was a part of African American life in the North. So while they did lead freer lives, undoubtedly, they still did face a lot of discrimination in the North as well as the South. So here we give you an idea of why slavery was so ingrained in the South and why they had so much of it down there. Really, the question is what effect did the cotton gin have on slavery? Ultimately, the cotton gin increased the ability to produce cotton to be sold by a machine. This machine removed the seed of the cotton plant automatically, and ultimately was a lot more efficient when producing cotton. So ultimately, what plantation owners in the South did was they planted more cotton, which dropped the price of cotton, which ultimately made them a lot of money. So with the higher production meant more slaves. So the cotton gin ultimately increased the demand for slavery, particularly throughout the South where cotton has the perfect growing environment, and it began spreading west. So then that begs the question in the South, why did, non-slaveholding white Southerners support slavery? And one thing you got to know about that is that most people in the South did not own slaves. There was a society in the South that was really the leaders in politics. They were leaders in the community. They were leaders as representatives to the South and the Southern way of life. And these folks were the plantation owners and the ultra wealthy. So the reason why, you know, most people in the South believe that slavery was okay is because they were all small-time farmers, and they believed the economy depended on slavery. So ultimately, if slavery wasn't in existence for most, cotton wouldn't be as in high demand. So they believed in that. So here we have the working conditions. The majority of slaves worked as field hands, working in the fields, picking cotton, and doing other jobs that ultimately would be related to farming and agriculture. There were some slaves that worked in the house. They would cook, clean, take care of the kids, ultimately keep the household, which is generally a woman's domain, in smooth working order. And then there's a quote to think about: slave young, slave long. Now, what does that actually mean? I want you to think about that. So here we have the living conditions. So if you're a visitor on the scene, I want you to think about what you might see, what you might smell in these communities, ultimately, that slaves had created around the plantations with the meager opportunities that they had. So here's a little quote I want you to think about. We had old ragged huts made out of poles, and some of the cracks chinked up with mud and moss, and some of them wasn't. We didn't have no good beds, just scaffolds nailed up to the wall, out of poles, and the old ragged mud throwed on 'em. That show was hard sleeping, but even that feel good to our weary bones after them long hard days in the field. That was a quote from somebody named Jenny Proctor, who was an ex-slave in Texas, ultimately giving her account of what it was actually like. So think about the things you might see. So ways that ultimately slaves were controlled, this is where it gets, very graphic and very inhumane. And a lot of the time, what slave owners would do is they would control them psychologically, with mind games ultimately, and they would make them act like they were children and treat them as children and inferior beings, and so they ultimately looked at the slave owners at times as parents. But I want you to think about the other ways, the inhumane ways. Slaves would be punished with whips and lashing, and they would be chained up in many ways, different forms. You absolutely horrible things. And this was just to control the slaves, because the biggest fear that a slave owner had was that there would be a slave uprising, because the slaves did outnumber the people living on these plantations. So you got to think about how a slave might feel after being punished. The emotions of anger and sadness. It was a very rough existence, and very, very horrible things were done to slaves in order to control them. So resistance to slavery, of course there was some resistance, the biggest fear being a slave uprising where slaves would revolt, which had happened. One slave uprising was known as the Nat Turner Rebellion, where ultimately a lot of white people living in a community were killed by Nat Turner and his followers. Ultimately, Nat Turner was caught and killed, but it showed that even the slaves were ready to get their freedom any means necessary. But the most common way would be like day-to-day resistance, finding ways of avoiding work. They'd break things, tools, things like that, so they'd have to spend their time doing those kinds of things. They would mess up the fields. They would kill and break some of the cotton plants and that kind of thing. So one of the quotes I want you to think about: my master had power and law on his side. I had a determined will. There is power in each. That was a quote by Harriet Jacobs. Ultimately, one of the most common ways to resist slavery was to run away, using the Underground Railroad. So they would follow the North Star to freedom in the North through a network of safe houses and people helping along the way to get slaves to freedom. And that was these are some of the ways that slaves resisted slavery. Slave families and communities. One of the biggest fears of being a slave was being sold away from your family. Families were often broken up because a slave owner simply wanted to own one and didn't see a need for the other, and they broke up a lot of families this way. But slaves ultimately did all they could to keep some normalcy in their life by marrying and having families and things like that. So you just got to think about how you'd feel if you were sold away from your family and you had no choice. It's really a tough thing to think about, but was a reality within these communities. There was leisure time, downtime for slaves. A lot of music came from slave culture, a lot of artwork. They would have corn husking parties. So you got to think about things you might hear if you were hanging out on one of these Saturday nights. They like to dance. So they did have some time to themselves. Maybe not always, but culturally we see some of the evidence of that. So definitely, this reflects the culture beyond slavery for African Americans during this time period. Um, the churches that slaves really held on to a religion, and religion was passed down through the slave owners. But with that, slaves really kind of created their own uh, um, way of worshiping God, and uh, a lot of the churches, the white churches, would justify slavery, and the African Americans taught a very different version of that. It says, rather than teach about obedience, black preachers told the story of Moses leading his people out of slavery. So they attached onto the Old Testament stories. um, Whites sometimes criticized the enthusiasm of black worshipers. This is what they had to hold on to, hope. They created their own churches. A lot of the time they would go into the woods, and they would, sit in these places, and they could become quiet places and things like that for fear of being broken up, which would happen sometimes in these communities. And then we talk about the culture and how we see that today. You look at some of the music. The blues definitely came from this time period. You look at forms of dance that can reflect break dancing and hip hop dancing and things like that. And then you hear about folk tales. Disney has picked up some of those folk tales. So you see it, it's influenced today's culture. You can look at the food. You can look at a lot of different things. So here we have just a synopsis of different aspects of African American culture in the mid-century of the 1800s.